in the choir loft area in back of where the preacher was preaching. And the rest of the people, the National Church staff, the folks who were attending, guests and visitors, were all seated out front. The young preacher had been requested to preach a 20-minute sermon. And the crowd seemed excited and even interested as our young hero started out. But when the 20 minutes were over, our young pastor did not stop. His 20 minutes, he stretched into 30 minutes, and the interest in the congregation seemed to wane some, and the 30 minutes became 40 minutes, and the amens coming from the clergy in back of him seemed to have stopped altogether. But this didn't deter him. 40 minutes became an hour-long sermon. And by now, he had no support from anyone whatsoever. And finally, when our young preacher was still going, and it had been an hour and 20 minutes, one of the people in the front row stood up and threw a hymnal at him. And the preacher ducked, and it hit an elderly clergy that was behind him. And as the elderly preacher began to fall to the ground, you could hear him audibly say, "Throw another one, I can still hear him preaching." You see, I'm thinking that if you were told to preach for 20 minutes, but instead preached for an hour and 20 minutes, well then, you must have thought pretty highly of yourself. What do you think? I mean, you must have thought that your thoughts were really something that was important, that other people needed to hear. And if you preached for an hour and 20 minutes when you had only been asked to preach for 20 minutes, well then, you must have thought you were pretty good. If you preached 4 times as long as you were supposed to preach, you must have thought that other people really needed to hear what you had to say if you preached that long when you had been asked to preach that short. Then you probably were filled with an awful lot of something called pride. Yep. It is the first of what have commonly been called the 7 deadly sins. Along with things like sloth and lust and gluttony and greed and wrath and envy, our Lenten series for this year. But the first in the list is almost always pride. So, since I had to preach on pride to kick this whole thing off, I decided to go to that great wealth of information, which is never wrong, called Wikipedia. And according to Wikipedia, pride is an inwardly directed emotion that refers to an inflated sense of the self or of one's status or of one's accomplishments. You see, you need to be clear about what pride is, just like you need to be clear about what pride is not. Some people equate pride with a positive self-image or a healthy sense of self-worth. That's not quite right. I thought it might be helpful if we considered Scripture on the subject. And so consequently, I had chosen the Scripture verses for tonight and thought that at first I was going to preach on that one from Proverbs, which talks about a haughty look, which means a prideful look. I thought about preaching on that part that says pride comes before destruction, or perhaps you know it better as pride comes before a fall. I thought about also preaching on that one from Matthew, where it talks about the scribes and the Pharisees kind of being prideful because they liked to make their phylacteries long. But then I thought that I would have to spend half the sermon explaining what phylacteries were. Actually, instead, what I thought was, if we were going to preach on pride, I would be better off going with what St. Paul had to say in the book of Romans, where Paul wrote, For by the grace of God given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each of you. Now, let's be clear about what Paul said, and let's also be clear about what Paul did not say. Here's the question for you. Did Paul say that you couldn't think highly of yourself? I'm actually waiting for an answer.
No.
Did Paul say that you couldn't think highly of yourself?
No.
No, that's exactly right. Did Paul say that you couldn't have a positive self-image?
No.
Did Paul say that you couldn't have a positive sense of self-worth?
No.
Did Paul say that you ought not think more highly of yourself than you ought?
Yes.
See, the key on that thing is more highly of yourself. The key on this whole thing is making sure that we can examine ourselves with sober judgment. Because quite frankly, I think that all of us like to sometimes think highly of ourselves. After all, we've been trying to impress positive self-images on children for decades. And I don't think that that's necessarily wrong. However, it's interesting that sometimes we don't want to look at ourselves with sober judgment. I remember when I was doing my internship. When I was doing my internship, I came across an elderly woman one time, and we sang the song Amazing Grace, kind of like what we did earlier today. When we sang the song Amazing Grace, she came up to me afterward and she said, can we change the words to that hymn? And I said, why do you want to change the words to that hymn? And she said, because it says that saved a wretch like me, and quite frankly, I don't feel like a wretch. And I thought to myself, you know what? I don't feel like a wretch most of the time either. But then I thought to myself, I don't feel like a wretch most of the time, and I don't think I am a wretch most of the time, but every once in a while, I'm pretty wretched. What about you? See, the idea is that we have to think of ourselves sometimes with sober judgment. We have to be able to acknowledge some of those things. We have to know when we are actually being prideful. And quite frankly, you know, that's one of those great words that theologians actually like to translate into Latin. So that it's they call it hubris. Isn't that a great word? Hubris. They call it hubris. And if you want to know what hubris is, it's thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to think. You want to know an example of when I had hubris? When my brother and I were teenagers. This is a really terrible confession. When my brother and I, this is thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to think. When my brother and I were teenagers, we said that it was our responsibility to the world to marry and breed because we needed to keep the gene pool high. That is hubris. That is thinking of yourself more highly than what you ought to think. And when we start to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think, this is where pride can become deadly. Let me see if I can put some flesh and bones on this. Let me see if I can address this in a way that makes it understandable. I'm German. I'm 100% German on my dad's side, and as far as I know, I think I'm 100% German on my mom's side. Or pretty close. I think that makes me German, doesn't it? And here's the deal. I'm actually pretty proud of my German heritage. And I think that there's nothing wrong with being proud of my German heritage, although I have to admit that there have been some shortcomings in German history. But the problem is that if I need to think of my German heritage highly, one of the ways people have a tendency to do that is to think of other people's heritages, other people's nationalities, other people's ethnicities lowly. You see, if I have to overinflate my own sense of heritage by underinflating, not a football, but somebody else's heritage, then this is where things go wrong, because suddenly if my heritage seems to be getting shortchanged, then it becomes easy to blame others for the faults or the failings of my own. And it is no longer healthy pride, but it now becomes hubris. It's no longer a positive self-image. It becomes racism. And I think all of us would agree that that can become deadly. Agreed? See, the idea of taking pride in that which is yours, there's nothing wrong with, but when it starts to become putting down that which doesn't belong to you. Before we moved here, we lived in Kansas. My youngest son became a huge Jayhawk fan. And he came home from school, and he learned a quote that went like this: "Rock, chalk, Jayhawk, boo to KSU." How many of you think there's anything wrong with rock, chalk, Jayhawk? That's healthy pride. But when it turns into boo to KSU, we have now crossed over the line into hubris. Let's see if I can put this another way. I was born a guy. I was born a boy, and I grew up to be a man. I understand myself to be male, and there's nothing wrong with masculinity or maleness. It's a good thing. In fact, it says that when God created the world, he created us in his image. Male and female, he created us. In the image of God, he created us. So, if I am proud of my maleness, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a positive self-image. But what if I start to think that male is best, that masculinity is the strongest, that male is the smartest? What if, in order to make me feel good about being a man, I have to denigrate or berate or lower the value of femininity or femaleness? Now I have passed from being proud of being a man to having hubris, which becomes sexism. And that's why we call pride potentially deadly. Incidentally, it's not just deadly because of the physical violence that can erupt from these things. It's deadly because it kills other things as well. It kills communication. It kills relationships. It kills community. And quite frankly, I think that there's already way too much fragmentation and discord and discontinuity in our world. What do you think? So if we're ever going to have hope, if we're ever going to have a prayer of bringing folks back together again, then it's absolutely imperative that we not only are able to point out what we think are the faults in others, but that we have a sober judgment, that we have an understanding of not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought to think of ourselves. St. Paul was right. For by the grace of God given to me, I say to you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but think of yourselves with sober judgment in accordance with the faith he has distributed to each of you. Because pride actually can become deadly. Probably why it's listed as the first of the 7 deadly sins in most lists. Thanks be to God that he sent Jesus, probably the only person who had a right to be prideful. But instead of touting his perfection, instead he used it for serving, for healing, for wholeness, for forgiving. I'm thinking, what do you think, this Lent, rather than just trusting those things, what if we actually tried to live them?